Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you may be. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Paul Saunders, the president of the Center for the National Interest. Excited to have this conversation today about the Great Iberian Blackout and how policymakers in the European Union are assessing that and responding to it. We're really thrilled to have with us today two outstanding panelists. The first, Tomasz Szmal, and Tomasz, I apologize that I don't speak Polish, so I may butcher that. Tomasz is with the strategic advisory firm Tretiak Szmal, where he's one of the founders. He headed the energy and natural resources practice at the White and Case law firm office in Poland. And prior to that, he was the director of the International and European Law Department in the General Prosecutor's Office. So someone who is kind of very much a practitioner, both in sort of a regulatory setting and in a private sector setting. And our second speaker today is Andreas Goldthau. Andreas is director of the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy at the University of Erfurt. I do a little bit better with German, Andreas, than with Polish. And Andreas has had a number of other positions, including at the University of London, the Central European University's School of Public Policy, here in the United States, actually at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, at Rand, and also at the Harvard Kennedy School. So we're really thrilled to have both of you with us today to talk about these kind of very dramatic events in Spain and Portugal of a few weeks ago, when the power grid really largely collapsed, and I think brought home for many how dependent our societies have become on their grids. So we'll start with Tomasz, then Andreas will respond to that. And when we finish, we'll have a moderated discussion. Please, during their comments, prepare any questions that you might have, and you're free to submit those through the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom page. So Tomasz, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you today about this blackout and what really happened in Spain. Preparing for this meeting in the morning, I asked my 7-year-old daughter where we get our electricity from. And she had no doubts answering, from a socket on the wall. And as a matter of fact, she was completely serious. And as a matter of fact, she was to some extent right. But what I'm using this story, unfortunately, in my opinion, a number of decision makers, legislators, and opinion leaders, NGOs, and all those people responsible for energy and climate policy within the European Union has similar or just slightly better perception of electricity origination, where it comes from, or what is quality, what are the laws of physics. And that, in my opinion, is the key background what happened in April 28 in Spain. As you remember, when blackout happened, we could observe complete chaos. The country practically did not function. People were buying food for cash. The communication did not work. And this reminded me a bit of days of late communist time in Poland, where power outages were typical and people got used to them. And I'm not a physicist, as you know, and Just quite opposite. I'm a lawyer, so please excuse me. The explanation may not be full and complete, but I think there is some consensus within the energy community. What was a real reason of this blackout, and what are the implications? Let me start with stating some obvious things that electricity may be characterized by numerous parameters. We all know voltage stability, balance, current, resistance, and frequency. And the frequency in this case is pretty important. In the days before the blackout, the power system seemed to be very stable, and this stability have been disrupted by renewable energy sources for the simple reasons. I mean, these sources are not stable, and energy is produced when the sun shines and the wind blows. And what is most important in this part, the renewable energy sources do not have what is known inertia. And inertia is actually the key word to understand what has happened. And what is inertia? Inertia is a feature of the power system that is based on the rotating generators and allows for stabilizing frequency fluctuation in the event of the sudden changes of energy production and consumption. So inertia, as a matter of fact, acts as a shock absorber, slowing down the change in frequency, giving time for primary reserve to come into play, and this stabilizes the system. And as you probably know, photovoltaic farms do not have inertia at all, and windmills have it only partially, mainly the large turbines. And inertia is provided by these rotating masses associated with the rotors, and they are directly connected to the power system. So inertia is provided by turbines installed in conventional energy sources, as coal, gas turbines, and thermal power plants, basically that have the rotating turbine. And by increasing the speed of rotor even a bit, they are able to accumulate excess energy. And by decreasing the speed of the rotating masses, they can return energy to the system. This is basically how the inertia stabilizes the system, stabilizes the frequency. And this makes the system work. Here, in this case, obviously the important part is the energy mix. And as the share of renewable energy sources in the energy mix increases, the inertia of the power system decreases, because often we close down, we decommission conventional energy units. And this decrease of inertia in the system leads to increase in the amplitude and dynamics of frequency fluctuations. So basically, the low inertia is the higher share of energy sources, and this could not basically stabilize the network. So in Spain, what happened was that a lack of sufficient inertia caused decrease of frequency from 50 hertz, which is voltage frequency throughout Europe, to 49 hertz. And which means that the regional power producers had to immediately disconnect from the national grid. In the energy mix in Spain is 80% of renewable, 20% conventional energy. So basically this lack of inertia rather proved to be too little in the case, and caused this blackout. And the situation in Spain may get even worse, because Sanchez government plans to shut down nuclear power plant and begin to shut down the nuclear power plants in 2027. So basically, what the lesson is learned is that we still need not only renewable energy sources, but we need inertia, which is conventional generation. So few conclusions. This is important from the perspective of energy transformation. This is important that we need to have stable capacity and stable available energy sources, and basically with necessary inertia. And I think that we cannot basically decommission all coal and gas-fired units, and we need them to stabilize the system. About the consequences, I could speak a bit later.
Well, thank you very much, Tomasz, for that kind of overview of what occurred. I have to say it's kind of striking that the system could go from 50 hertz to 49, and that's enough to shut down an entire country. as a non-engineer. It's striking to me. Andreas, let's turn to you for your thoughts on certainly first of all on Tomáš's comments there and the grid, but certainly also secondly on how you see policymakers, responding to this situation in Germany and across the EU.
Right. Thank you, Paul, for having me. And I think it's very important that we keep up the transatlantic conversation on important things. And I very much welcome the opportunity today. Thank you. Well, if you look at Spain, you sometimes feel like it's great to be in a rainy country over here, which is not very welcome on most days. But it's given the situation there, you sometimes feel, or around those days, the blackout occurred, and when people started talking about solar, particularly being a cause of that, you start wondering, in fact, whether it is a good idea to put all your eggs into one basket, which is to say, do we really want to make renewables and particularly solar in many places, plus wind, obviously, the centerpiece, the backbone of our energy system? And I guess the one thing I want to say in the very beginning is that a lot of observers immediately went, after the outage occurred in Spain, they went and said, oh, look, it's all renewables, isn't it? Because they're volatile, as Tomáš has rightly pointed out, because there's intermittency problems, because the rain may, the sun may or may not shine, and wind may or may not be there. But I mean, we're seeing a couple of countries doing quite well when it comes to an increasing share of renewables in the mix. I mean, the country where I am, Germany, is on average at 55% of renewables in the grid, in the power system. I mean, that's roughly $5 trillion economy. So you can manage, it works. There's very little instability in the grid. Actually, there is none. It's remarkably stable. There's even times when in this country, you have about 120% renewables in the system. And that's where problems start coming in, because prices go negative. You need to find ways of exporting stuff. It raises all sorts of issues when it comes to the supply side. You have to shut down lots of plants and all the rest of it. So there are issues, but the sheer percentage and the sheer share of renewables as such is not a problem. What is a problem, and I think that came out very well with what Tomáš said, we're facing the moment now that we're moving towards a more renewable-based electricity system. We're facing simply a lot of new challenges, and we have known them, but now the power outage has driven them home. Grid management is a massive challenge. This is where we need to go. Storage is important, and storage is not only batteries, it's all kinds of storage systems that we can think of, from P2X to hydro pump stations and all the rest of it. Hydro stations and using them to store energy. Inertia, absolutely. We need to find ways of storing some of the surplus energy produced from, say, wind farms, by way of putting up new technologies, flywheels, and all these kind of things that help us balance the system. But I think the one thing that the Spain story has also driven home is the issue of interconnectedness. One problem that Spain faced is that they essentially have 3 interconnectors to adjacent countries. One is Portugal, that wasn't great because the country was affected as well. One to Spain, and that wasn't very big, and the Spanish shut it down the moment the outage occurs, and then to Morocco. And that is it. Systems that are a lot more interconnected, this country, other countries, Poland, to neighboring countries, tend to be a lot more stable. And so the last element that I just wanted to add here is essentially we need to add a lot more infrastructure, physical grid infrastructure to the existing infrastructure to turn a system essentially upside down. Because the way the system has worked so far is it worked on a centralized model. You had massive, big power plants, coal or nuclear based, or maybe gas based, And so you had energy input, feedstock, conversion, and then it went all the way into the grid, into end consumers. Now we're decentralizing that system, and a decentralized system has very different properties. It looks different, it needs to be managed differently, and it requires additional interconnectors to adjacent countries and consumer regions in order to balance the intermittency problems. The IEA, for the sake of the argument, estimates around 600 billion a year that need to be invested into the grid globally. At the moment, the grid investment is essentially roughly where we have been about 15 years ago. So it didn't grow that much, but renewables grew a lot, and that's a disconnect, and that needs to be matched. Maybe a final point, just a number, and to underpin my last point. I mean, this year, the European Union will add about 90 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity to the grid. Just by comparison, if you have a really large nuclear power plant, you get 2 gigawatts. So we're adding 45 nuclear power plants this year in terms of capacity, not production. And that in itself is a challenge because it requires new grid management, storage systems, inertia, interconnectedness, and all the rest of it. But it also tells you that there is no way back. We're turning the system upside down, and that's not even a normative question or one of ideology. I think it is essentially where the system goes. There is a business case behind many of these investments now, and it is also something that obviously has been fostered by policy frameworks, setting incentives to build up that capacity. Now that train has left the station. We simply have to deal with the situation going forward with all the challenges that this entails, and that maybe just to go a little bit back to policy, one of the things, obviously, that comes into play, and maybe that's something we want to talk about a little bit later. One of the things that this requires is thinking about how we essentially transition well using gas-fired power plants and other fossil fuel-based power plants to facilitate that move, add to grid stability. But at the same time, it raises new security questions, the whole cybersecurity issue, the whole hybrid warfare nexus that I think people have immediately started talking about in the case of Spain. I think these are the things that now come to the fore a lot more forcefully than they have been in the past, when we had centralized systems that reliably produced one stream of electricity into the system. I think these times are gone, and we have to live with it and look forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for your comments. And just a reminder to our audience here, please do submit any questions that you might have using the Q&A tab, and I'll go through those. We have a couple of different questions that have come in from Paul Murphy. The first set of questions that he asks relate to renewable generation. Is there a ceiling for renewables as a percentage of a grid? In other words, he's asking, is the grid sort of automatically at risk once you get above a certain threshold? What's the science on that? What's the academic research on that? Do we sort of know enough to know where the line is? Andreas, do you have any thoughts on that? You touched on some of those questions a little bit. In Germany's experience, 55% has been manageable.
Yes, and usual disclaimer, my knowledge of physics goes back to high school, where I graduated in physics, but that's literally where I left things. So my knowledge here is based on both on what I've learned through discussions with people who know more about these things than I do, and based on a few numbers that I've worked on my own when it comes to the transition of the system and the policies and regulations behind that. So the first answer is, in principle, no. There is no ceiling or no percentage where the system, the grid, would become unstable based on renewables. Why should it? I mean, electrons are electrons. They don't look different if they're produced and generated from wind or from coal, from thermal power plants. The one, and we have seen various, not only Germany's, but various energy systems, power systems being run on 100% renewable. Some of them, like in Norway, which runs 100% on renewable, are based on hydro. So it's very relatively stable supply of electricity. It's akin to a thermal power plant, essentially producing a similar or comparable number of electrons reliably at a given moment in time, unless you deplete your hydropower station. But so countries do manage that. Countries like Germany, on average, have more than 50%, and it goes up to 100% and more in some days. But it also goes down to say 15 or 20%, particularly in winter, when again, a rainy country and a dark country, doesn't produce a lot of renewables from solar and wind. And that's exactly where backup systems need to come in. They need to come in reliably and quickly. The answer of this country, but also other countries, has been to say we'll build more gas-fired power plants, which can be restarted very quickly, brought into the system the moment it is needed, and the price incentives is there. And that way it maintains exactly what Tomasz has been talking about, grid stability, and particularly stability during during times of volatile supply of one specific source, even though that source might now be covering a substantial part of supply. So the key message here, to cut a very long story short, the key message here is the renewables and renewable electrons are not the problem. The problem is volatility. And this needs to be managed and needs to be managed well. And that requires a different type of systems management, which also requires a different way of thinking about the system, with a lot more slack in the system and a smarter management of supply and demand patterns, different types of real-time price incentives, and all the rest of it that in the end is there as technology. It needs to be rolled out. The goal of some countries, not all countries, is 100% renewables in the grid, which is what I understand grids can obviously do, but it requires not only additional capacity in renewables, but also, again, a very different way of thinking about the management of all of it, the infrastructure part of it, and the connectedness between various different decentralized centers of supply and demand, which simply looks very different or not necessarily comparable to the kinds of grids we're talking about today. So that's where I leave it. But I think the long and the short of it is no, there is no ceiling.
Thank you, Andreas. Tomasz, do you have anything to add on that?
I do fully agree. I do fully agree with Andreas in terms of that there is no clear ceiling, although the awareness is not that big, or was not that big. That was my sort of story about this 7-year-old daughter, that seems that the decision makers, tend to create some targets like 100% renewable in 2050 and whatever, right? And just giving some targets without reflection, will physics make it? And that's basically the story. So there is no ceiling, although the timeline should be considered as one thing. And as a matter of fact, very truly said that we are turning upside down the energy system, and these things will happen. And so we basically either we have to agree with that, so that we'll have some kind of shortages and issues on the road. So that's the consequence of it. If we decided to go this route, then we need to think about this as well. Although Germany and Poland, we are at the moment in the pretty safe situation. We have 55%, we have 70% conventional. So we do still have the generators, we do have this inertia, we can stabilize the system by this. When you have 80-20, like it is the case of Spain, 80 renewables, 20 conventional, then it's bit more difficult. That's one thing. And the second is that obviously we can keep these conventional reserves, but will cost a lot of money, right? So so we need to have it in mind.
So you brought up, Tomasz, there the question of money, and Paul Murphy actually has asked sort of a follow-up question, I think, that gets to that. Andreas, you talked about flywheels or storage, all of the various other kinds of things that one might need, to manage a grid as it gets closer and closer to being 100% renewable, and you have the variability and you don't have the inertia and et cetera. How does that all get paid for? Does it go sort of ultimately to ratepayers? If it goes to ratepayers, does it go to households or to commercial consumers or to both? If it doesn't go to ratepayers, it seems like it goes to taxpayers. It seems like it has to be sort of one or the other. How do you think that question gets solved? And either of you, maybe Andreas, if you want to go first.
Quickly, maybe a few points, and I think maybe it's important to remind the audience in the US that the pricing levels and the price points for energy, specifically gas and also electricity, is very different from the US. I mean, even before the Ukraine war and Russia's aggression, before the energy crisis in 22-23, we were talking about massive differences in prices. For the sake of the argument, if you have a $3 or $2.50 gas MMB per MMBTU at Henry Hub in the US, you would have 9 in Europe. And that was pre-crisis, right? So we're talking about a price spread of 2-3 times. And that was a reality before everything else kicked in, including, by the way, now the additional costs that come back to this related to networks and network infrastructure investment, all the rest of it. Now, post-crisis, on average, gas prices, which in part still feed into electricity prices, they're about some 20% up compared to pre-crisis levels. And that's structural. So you would, regardless of whatever else we do and whatever else it is that we need to do in order to turn the system upside down, as Paul just said, it is a cost to industry, to households, to consumers. And that's a reality, and is something that provides Europe with a structural disadvantage. It is something that worries policymakers. It is something that feeds concerns of people, and that also in part feeds or informs voting behavior, particularly when it comes to the extreme left, and in part the extreme vice versa, the extreme left, and in part the extreme right over here. So these are things that I think we need to bear in mind. We have different price levels over here. Now, who bears those costs? There is, I think, and maybe one thing I want to say as well, particularly some countries like Germany have very homegrown problems because they have not done what was needed in time. They have not invested enough in grid infrastructure networks. And they did not do this despite the fact that they knew they would have a very ambitious decarbonization pathway, which precedes the energy crisis and everything else. So there was a lack in investment, which was structural, but also because of a lack of foresight when it comes to politics. People in charge, governments, did not do the right thing and incentivized investment the way they should have done, which means you now have a situation where network costs are going through the roof. And that's exactly the answer to Paul's real question: who bears the costs? It is not the taxpayer. it is mainly consumers. And it is both the industrial consumers, although they get a different price than consumers in households. And it is obviously the average household, which increasingly spends more on an increasing share of its available income on electricity services. It comes mainly in two shapes. One is the price of electricity, but the second is network costs. And they are increasing in various ways and for various reasons. One is because infrastructure investments need to happen, and they need to happen quick. And second, because also of a change in the system. It's not only electricity networks that need to be ramped up, but the gas network that is still there keeps on costing money despite the fact that fewer people use it, which means the individual costs per consumer who is still on the grid will go higher and higher as well. And that adds to the ETS, the emissions trading system, which adds a cost to the fossil fuel by way of essentially putting a tax on it. And that adds as an additional cost to the price point that average consumers face. So it's various reasons why, but mainly networks and prices. It is not taxes, although at some point it may well be that average households might be supported through state subsidies, literally, because of unbearable electricity costs if they are not kept in check going forward.
Tomasz, do you want to add anything on the question of who pays, and maybe also taking advantage of the fact that Andreas is of course in Germany, one of the largest and wealthiest countries in Europe. Poland, where you are, actually, very impressive economic growth in recent years, and becoming a more significant economy, but not in the same place as Germany. Do you think there are any sort of differences in political attitudes, public opinion on these questions of energy costs?
Yes. I mean, that's a very, very good question. Who should pay for that? And obviously, we pay for that. And I remember we as consumers, because all these costs of infrastructure upgrades, they are put in a tariff, and the tariff is spread out throughout all the consumers in the bills. So that creates some kind of unfairness, although I experienced working with the renewable energy sources developers that they are willing to pay more for the infrastructure to connect, for cable pulling, for direct lines, but they, at the end of the day, energy grid operators, I mean, they pass through the costs to consume all consumers. So this is how the system works, and in the past, when we have only conventional energy in Poland, we have to have like a sort of to stable market. We have to have some more installed capacity of 20%. And now we have 3 or 4 times more capacity in the peak time that we use, right? So the same with Germany, right? So we have heavily invested in renewable as well, although in Poland it's just 30%, but still it is significant change over years. And that creates issues for industries. Well, that creates problems in costs and competitiveness of the European Union as such.
Thank you very much, Tomasz. So today is a day for questions from Paul's, because you've had mine and there have been questions from Paul Murphy, and now we have a question from Paul Baumann. I think the two of you have already sort of come to a fairly similar place on this, but just to kind of ask the question sharply. Andreas, and this is what Paul Baumann is asking. Andreas, you in your remarks described the crisis really as a consequence of failure to invest in other supporting infrastructure that was kind of necessary for the renewable transition, where Tomasz, you were kind of blaming it more directly on the renewables themselves. So Paul is asking, Andreas, do you kind of agree with Tomasz that the renewables were the problem, or do you disagree?
I mean, if the question is whether renewables were driving costs for consumers, then I would say yes, for quite some time, that was indeed the case. For the sake of the argument, the feed-in tariffs that supported the ramp up of renewables in many parts of Europe essentially added a cost to electricity consumption for every single consumer. And so it added a cost to for households, and that was a reason why prices were above what they might have been had that policy measure not been in place. The biggest price increase, and one that almost killed European industry, let's put it this way, really, was not because of renewables. It was because of Russia's weaponization of energy. And there's reasons why Russia was able to do this in the first place, some flawed gas supply policies to start off with. But the point here is not renewables. The point here is the biggest external shock to the energy system, and the biggest external price shock, was it came from fossil fuels. And a lesson from that is that the dependence on foreign fossil fuels and the volatile nature and the volatility these fuels can bring to the system needs to come down. One of the reasons why the European Union put up various policy measures and big packages, including REPowerEU and so on and so forth, not only to phase out Russian gas, which they may or may not be able to do within the time frame they have set, but also essentially to rely on things they can control. That's homegrown energy, and homegrown energy is not fossil because Europe doesn't have much of that. So if you ask me about who is to blame, I would say one of the reasons why we're facing the situation we're facing now is essentially not because of renewables, but because of fossil fuels, the consequence of which is additional investment into decarbonization, industrial innovation, industrial decarbonization of the electricity system, of the power system, which will add costs. But maybe a long-term perspective, which I think is fair and important to mention, I think the best way to bring down the cost of fossil fuels for people is to ramp up renewables, because the marginal cost of production is zero. Once the infrastructure is there is no cost to feedstock or anything. And so and maybe that's the good news for Europe and its economy, whatever is left of it after all of this is done. The good news here is that essentially households will feel the price impact of a system the moment it is significantly more decarbonized than the present system. And that's simply because of simple microeconomics. So various answers to various parts of recent European history. Overall, bottom line, I would say, again, the train has left the station. We got to live with a system that is decarbonizing, and it's decarbonizing quick. And that's what we need to manage.
Let me one comment.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tomasz, please.
If I may, I mean, just I was not criticizing renewables as such, right? And it's not the point. And I think you're, Andreas, right, saying that that this is sort of decision we are making, to get out of fossil fuels. But what I'm trying to say is that in this case, this was inertia, but there may be other sort of laws of physics that will not work. We have not considered. That's the point, that in other country something else may go wrong with this. So what I'm trying to say that the regulators and the decision makers, they need to carefully scrutinize that and try to analyze all those issues very carefully. What has happened and why this happened and how we can avoid it, and not necessarily just put new regulations, because that's the easiest and what the Brussels love. I mean, if they have a problem when they put new regulation and they force all 27 countries to adjust, to adopt, and they think they're the smartest on the earth, right, doing it. But sometimes it's just a common sense, right? I mean, you have to sort of create a model and create it, and adjust it and adopt it to the circumstances. But it seems to me that not often, or sometimes it's not the case, and we are risking a lot doing it very quickly.
Thank you, Tomasz. So I think we're having actually a very nuanced conversation about these very complicated issues, and I'm kind of grateful to both of you for allowing that to occur. What I wonder is, are policymakers and public opinion sort of having the same nuanced conversation and drawing the same kinds of nuanced lessons about what occurred, and maybe just to frame it as a simpler question, what do you think policymakers and the public are across the EU are taking from this? Certainly, there's been a lot of discussion of the renewables question. There's been a lot of discussion lately about nuclear energy, and Andreas, you sort of brought up the question of things that Europe can produce at home versus things that require importing fuels. Maybe Tomasz, we can start with you. This time we've started with Andreas, I think, a few times. What lessons do you see coming out of all of this for publics and for policymakers, and also any thoughts on
Sure.
the nuclear question?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I was kind of surprised that this topic lived very shortly in the European Union. I think that I had an impression that it was just a one day, maybe 2 days topic discussed among some experts, what has happened. And I did not observe closely Spain, how long it took in Spain, but generally in Europe, it seemed to me like, okay, it happened, sometimes it happens, so let's go forward. It was very different to me when I observed the situation of Fukushima in Japan. When the Fukushima happened, I had an impression that this happened in Germany almost, right? I mean, that this was so hot for months, and it created a change in Germany toward shutting down the nuclear power plants. And so it was surprising to me, how quiet it was about this shortage in Spain, the blackout in Spain. So that was my observation, and why it happened. I mean, I think it's not very convenient. I mean, I think that people do not like to hear any obstacles and problems, and they just try to avoid it, not hearing it. That's my impression, and I think that. That basically all the decision makers, think tankers, they should sort of put more efforts in analyzing this and listen to the scientists if they're saying that something is hardly possible or not possible, or may create issues. Because it seems to me that scientists, they say it like the or the technical people, but the decision makers often don't want to hear it. So that's my takeaway.
Andreas, your
Yeah,
thoughts. Your thoughts.
yeah. Look, Paul, I'm just still thinking. So, maybe two quick thoughts. Just doing full justice to my passport, and I have to say something about nuclear. I think I'm with you, Tomas, to say why has the discussion around the outage, the power outage, essentially taking Spain off the grid? That's a whole economy. Why has the discussion around this not kind of had bigger repercussions across Europe? It did have, by the way, but maybe in different ways than that we're discussing it here, right? The security crowd has picked it up quite a bit, but they essentially took this as an example of what could happen should systems become vulnerable, which is not a technical issue. It's not one related to energy technologies and which one is best and how to combine them. It was more a security and resilience conversation. So it has been picked up, but indeed, it kind of withered away quite quickly. But I think, to be fair, half a day of a power outage doesn't quite compare to the fallout of a full nuclear power plant blowing up. So I think I think there's a bit of a difference still, and I think the moment power was back, people went like, oh, hold on, what can we learn from this? And maybe we draw some lessons, but it doesn't necessarily put in question an entire technology. Whereas, in the case of Fukushima, that probably was a little bit different. I think the one question in this country, but also in other countries, even France, which had relied on some of its overseas territory for a while, when it comes to fuels, essentially is where do you get the feedstock from for your nuclear power plants? I mean, last time I looked on a map in Europe, is we don't have many of the uranium mines you would possibly need to produce that stuff. And then again, you get into issues related to external supplies and feedstock and maintenance and all the rest of it. But that's just an aside. Maybe more substantially, how do policymakers respond? They respond as you would expect. People get grumpy, and policymakers try and find an answer. The one response that many European governments had on rising energy prices across Europe, and we did the numbers on this, was to throw money at the problem. So to ease the pain, there were all sorts of things: a price break, a price cap, subsidies to individuals, subsidies to car owners, and essentially a subsidy for gasoline to ease the pain for commuters. And all of that is what governments did short notice in 22 and 23, up to the tune of essentially half the German budget. Half the German federal budget. That was the pledges that were given just in terms of subsidies and public support to ease the pain. So that's what policymakers do, and that's not sustainable. Obviously, you can do this once maybe, and that all of it was used. Some of it was for pledges, not everything was spent, but you can do it once maybe in one of those crises. You can't do it very often. What maybe less substantially in terms of the dollars and euro terms behind the policy responses. If you go to any place in Eastern Germany, where you still have a lot of heavy industry, chemical plants, power plants, petrochemical industry, and if you ask people there what they would like to see, the one thing they tell you is we would like to have Russian gas and Russian oil back, because that was the feedstock that was reliable, that was comparably affordable. It wasn't cheap, but it was affordable, and that was kept those sites running. They found it very, very hard to transition away from the Russian fossil fuels, but second, into something that provides comparable added value for local populations and state coffers and feeds into local budgets without the kind of model or industrial model underpinning those regions for almost centuries now, at least decades and decades and decades. So they would they demand for a very quick and cheap solution to the fuel supply issue and the price issue, and you do have policymakers picking that up. You do have people asking for maybe a different stance on Russian gas imports. They ask for a slower pace of industrial decarbonization based on fossil fuels, maybe not necessarily from Russia, but other sources. And you do have voters turning to parties that promise to bring Russian gas back. That's mainly parties on the very far right. So you do have that. The question is really whether those policymakers will be strong enough and are able to put into practice the promises that they make. One of the parties, again, on the far right, is very strong on chopping off the windmills that are existing, or at least putting a strong regulatory constraints on adding further windmills. So the point simply is there are policy responses, but at the moment, the trajectory is not greatly changed in many or most of European countries. But that's also a function of sheer economics. It just makes sense to put up some of the power plants, the nuclear power plants, the windmills, the offshore wind farms, not because you get state subsidies for it, but because they are in the money. And as long as that happens, I don't see a great deal for change, but I could be wrong.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So we have a lot of questions and limited time here, and I want to give a couple of questions here to people who haven't previously asked one. And I'll ask you each to try to be pretty brief so we can finish on time. And I have actually one more question that I'd like to ask if we have enough time for that. So one question from Michael Bradshaw, who's asking, what about the role of contracts for difference, feed-in tariffs, strike prices, all the things that policymakers have used to encourage investment in renewables? How will they impact the near-term cost of green power in Europe? I think that means in Europe.
It's going on.
And then the second question from Matt Wald, and let's just do these together to keep it kind of expeditious. And here I'll compress the question. You know, we had a big blackout in the eastern United States in 2003. We had actually a national commission jointly with Canada to investigate that. Are you confident that there will be kind of an independent, nonpartisan investigation of the Spanish blackout? So maybe Tomasz, you first, if you have.
Yeah, if I may, I don't have much to say about this. What the Spanish government will do with that. I know how they set up this investigation, but definitely the grid operator, has a lot to think of after this what happened, and the government. So I hope they will investigate and will put right measures to manage it in the future. But about Michael's question related to the pricing, and well, it's very good one, because each investment seems to be based on some kind of subsidies. I mean, be it a contract for difference, feed-in tariff, or strike price. So it's interesting that there is very little market in the energy market. I mean, investments are very often based on the subsidies, and that's how this business goes. And people, I mean, the companies basically, they do compete over the subsidies, and the subsidies encourage the investment. It's the case of it's not the EU, but the British Hinkley Point nuclear power plant, and also the Polish power plant, this Polish nuclear power plant, that because we just basically go against the European Union, or against this trend to shut down nuclear power plants. We want to build one. actually, not only one, but a couple of those, seeing it as a future. We as a Poland, we're coming to the nuclear club quite late, and we do not have any handicap except for the lessons learned in other jurisdictions. But this also be based on the feed-in, on the contract for difference price has to be accepted by the European Commission as a state subsidy. So so that's there is not much market.
Andreas, any thoughts?
Just a very quick one. I think, because we have talked a lot about grid and technology and all this, I think that question is spot on. We need to talk finance, and I think to make this very short, contracts for difference, I think are a wonderful, innovative means to enhance or to foster stable expectations amongst investors. And investors, maybe nuclear, but mainly into solutions that that decarbonize the system, whether it's the power system or the industrial system, and where you do indeed face quite some financial risk doing that. Indeed, it is a bit of a subsidy, but it doesn't have to be, really. Contracts for difference are not an internal subsidy. They come in at situations where the return is or let's put it differently, they stabilize the return. That's what they do. And for that, they're, I think, a good means and a good instrument. There may be other innovative financial instruments that could do the same thing. And that's exactly where I think the state should, in fact, be coming in with those kind of instruments. It's not necessarily long-term subsidies that are poured onto or over a certain technology. It is instruments that set incentives and set them well, and I think CFDs are great here.
Thank you very much. So let me ask a very quick question here, in just like 1 minute from each of you as we wrap up here. You both have talked a lot in different ways about how expensive this is. I mean, the energy transition in the European Union and how high costs are in the EU. Do you think that the EU's approach is something that is replicable internationally? And I know we could have a whole separate discussion on that, but just very briefly, perhaps starting with you, Tomasz, this time, and then finishing with Andreas.
Norway is 100% renewable for years now, right? Because they have a lot of hydro. So there are countries that this is completely natural to be 100% renewable because of the energy mix So I'm not sure whether it's replicable. I think that we are doing a lot to phase out the fossil fuels, conventional power. This will take some time, but decision has been made. So
my two-liner on this, yeah. Look, I mean, we're patting ourselves on the back here. We're becoming very clean and very green. Germany still has a very dirty electricity system. Let's not forget that. There's still a lot of coal in this. If you go to Norway or even further, say Brazil is 80% renewable. Kenya is 100% renewable. So there are countries that are renewable, and so we have to catch up, not them. But I think the one question that is out there, and I think this is where the jury really is out, is whether Europe is able to demonstrate that a decarbonized system creates welfare that give people a good life and a high quality life. And this is then the test. I think this is where Europe needs to stand the test. Whether the toolbox is something that travels, that's a very different question. The EU does many things that other countries don't want to do, and rightly so. But I think the main issue really is, can we run a 100% renewable system or a decarbonized system that creates the added value and the welfare that sustains people and their good lives? And if we stand that to test, then I think everyone else will queue and say, how have you done that? And I'd be very happy if that was the case.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think we had a great, very rich conversation here. Appreciate each of you taking time out of your afternoons to do that. And thank you very much to our audience for joining too. Thank you so
very
much.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank
Yes,
you, everyone.
yes. Bye.